Welcome, everybody. Tonight we're going to be working on the first part of Unit 6, which covers chapters 7 and 8 in our textbook. We are now post-midterm grading, so we're like kind of moving into the back end of the course and, kind of racing towards the finish line now. So we're past the halfway point, which is kind of like a, for sure, because I know midterms do cause stress for people. We have a couple different topics that we're going to cover here tonight, and you can see that chapter 7 is all about links, more layout techniques, and talking about mobile, including media queries. That's a pretty big topic there. And then when we move into chapter 8, we're going to talk about this technology called tables. There will be assignments related to these down below in the unit. Looking at the topics for the unit, if you break it down by chapter, right? So you have, this is the chapter 7 stuff here on the left. So we're going to look at hyperlinking, this thing called ARIA roles. That's going to be a pretty brief little discussion. Talking about images with CSS, more layout techniques, CSS for printing again. And I thought we talked about that last chapter, so maybe it moved chapters between book editions and I didn't update it, so I apologize for that. We're going to talk about considerations for mobile design, including media queries, the viewport meta tag, and then talking about adding, they call it flexible in the book, but really we're looking at the word responsive design so that things respond automatically to the size of your screen. All right, and there's techniques for that. Chapter 8 will subsequently cover tables, as I mentioned. That's not a topic for tonight, though. All right, so moving on, let's grab the PowerPoint here. We'll start with the chapter 7 PowerPoint. I'm going to download it and execute it from here. And let's roll. All right, so here's some of the topics. We're going to talk about flexbox. That's kind of a newer CSS technique. We're also going to talk about the CSS grid layout system. That's been around for a while now. We're also going to take a look at how you configure your web pages for mobile so that they hopefully look good on a mobile device, and remembering that mobile is the primary viewing platform for web pages these days. And then probably most importantly, we're going to be looking at media queries and how those operate and how we can leverage that to adapt to any type of screen, and basically learn responsive techniques. Now, what I'm going to do with this Flexbox thing, and I'm going to actually go to W3 Schools to kind of play with some of this stuff, just so you guys can see how it works. I don't do a super heavy requirement on having you guys do this as homework, and I don't think the case studies really delve too deeply into it either. But I do have an extra credit assignment that if you take your website project and convert it to a flex layout, which is something you might want to do, I'm just putting it out there, you would get extra credit for it. So if you use these flex techniques, there's points on the table that you can grab basically for free. All right. The interesting thought about this is when you're working with this new property, right? So it is, if you guys remember from last week, we did display block, display inline. We talked about display inline block. And we also talked about display none, where it makes something disappear. Well, there's another few options, and one of those options is display flex, right? And it is basically a way to control how stuff fits on the screen. And I'm going to typically say it's mostly in the horizontal dimension that I see this used. And you'll notice it says best for one dimension, a row or a column, but most often I see it for a row. And I can think of all these scenarios where you're on a web page and sometimes they'll have it like broken into 3 columns. And then if you narrow up your screen or switch to like tablet mode or something, those 3 columns still exist, but then you squeeze it down to a phone and maybe they don't fit, and you like, how do you contend with that, right? So this is kind of why they invented uh flex. They have a couple different values that they use for flex, and there's this ability to do wrapping or not wrapping or wrap in reverse, all very kind of weird little things. And then you also have the direction in which you're flexing. Are you flexing across a row, which is across the screen from left to right, or are you flexing from top to bottom? That's, like I said, that's a little bit more unusual, but it is done. Um, and then are you also maybe reversing the order of things? This is kind of a strange thought, right? So this CSS technique can actually take something on the screen in the order that it was in and change the order. Okay, weird for sure. Right. Let's look at kind of the concepts here first, and then we'll go over to W3 and play with it a little bit. All right. So kind of the thought is, if I set up a area of my page, and I think this is a nice little example, because this is not an unusual technique on a website. You go to a website and they might have some stuff at the top, and then maybe they're selling you some products and they got a big image, and then they might have three boxes like purchase, explore, gallery, or something like that, right? And that looks good on the big screen, and then all of a sudden your screen gets a little smaller or your screen gets a lot bigger. Wouldn't it be nice if the boxes automatically adjusted to the size of the screen? We learned from the examples that we did last week, and I'll go back to my not so pretty work from last week, where I was playing with these weird layout things, right, with these boxes and how the boxes sit, and how weird it was to try to get the image to sit over here and the words to sit over there, and then we have to do a float and clear the float and all that stuff, and that stuff is tricky. And then on top of it all, if I change my screen size, right, it gets to a point where it fits okay, and then after a while I get to this width where the stuff doesn't fit, and what happens to Homer? He jumps down farther on the page, and it starts looking terrible. Flex is really built to handle that issue. That's what it's all about. And like I said, predominantly in a row or across the screen fashion, right? You can also do this vertically, so from top to bottom. So in other words, if I were to size my screen and go like that with it, I could still make all the stuff fit and flow correctly. That one isn't quite, for just kind of hard to really explain this. It isn't from the standpoint of like normal usage more important than the horizontal one. That one seems to be the one that really throws people. So what I'm going to do to demo this, rather than code it into my site, because I really don't want to restructure everything right now, is I'm going to go to W3 Schools, and I'm going to go, and actually this would be a CSS property, wouldn't it? Yes, it would be CSS. And somewhere here, and I should probably just, search it. And there it is. Flexbox is the thing that we're looking at. All right. So before I even go into the sample editor here, I want you to notice how they have these boxes laid out on the screen. And if I come out of full screen view, right, as long as the boxes fit in the larger blue box, they don't change. They're fine, right? But the moment I start making the box a little too small for it to hold them, watch what happens to the boxes. And I know that as you're watching both on Zoom or on video, and I'm being very strategic here, I'm making it smaller incrementally, because especially on Zoom when I'm streaming it out, the students don't see the gradual effect of it. But the point is, no matter how small I make it, the boxes keep adapting and adapting. You see what I mean? And with the approach that I was using here, when I start getting too small, it starts to break. Not a good layout technique, right? And I can solve this problem either by switching over to a flex approach, or I can write media queries. That works too. That's why these two topics are in the same chapter, by the way. All right, so going back to the flexbox thing, I'm going to click on the try it now thing because I think this is really helpful to kind of see, just to see how it's applied. So if you look really carefully on the left side of the screen here, you'll notice that we have all our style tags are listed here. The structure of the document, like if you study it, there's an H1, that's this. There's a couple of paragraphs down here, that's this stuff. Both of those are irrelevant. What we do have, though, is a collection of divs, each with a number inside, and one larger div that holds all of them. And I want you to notice what they did is they put the style for flex basically on the outer container. So up here in the code, and I'll zoom in ever so slightly, right? So the larger container that holds all the divs, we're telling it to display flex. We don't want it to wrap. So in other words, when I make the screen small, I don't want like the number 8 to jump down and the number 7 to jump down, right? I want them all to stay in that same row. So no wrap. That's the wrap feature. Is that necessary? Not, it's not obligatory, right? And you honestly, what you can do is you can test it, right? So if I got rid of this line, or better yet, let's comment it out. Run the code. Still looks the same, but as I make it smaller, and I don't know if you guys are, yeah, it's kind of hard to see on here, but it's not including the 8 in there anymore. All right, so I'm not a huge fan of doing it like that, but it is what it is. I always recommend that as a good setting, by the way. So no wrap. Next thing that we have down here is there's a bunch of divs that are inside the container. And I want you to notice how that's addressed here. So this little way of saying it is the styles here are being applied only to the divs inside the flex container, right? And notice what we're doing here. We're just setting the colors, the width, the height, the margins, the alignment, the line height, and the font size, right? So pretty pedestrian stuff, right? Nothing really too fancy. But the whole point is, if you want to, let's say, have smaller boxes, right? And that's the approach you're using. It does give you this flexibility technique that I think is pretty fascinating. If I were to change this to wrap, and I just want to show you the difference, right? So if it is wrapping, this is what it does. So when I make it smaller, 3 moves down automatically. And you see how that's, they're both kind of slick, actually. Like it depends on what you're shooting for on your website and what makes sense for your content. Just because it's possible doesn't mean you should use it, but I could see a lot of usage for this, right? And you have to admit it's a whole lot easier than figuring out how to float left, float right, clear the float, make the sizes, does it fit, do I need a margin, all that stuff, because that stuff can be pretty tricky, real frankly. So this is the technique for doing flex. All right. The other technique that they're talking about here, and this is also related, by the way, to the flex technique, is they have a command called justify. And if you guys have ever used the word processor, right, like when you're doing like you center your text or you left a line or you right align your text, often a word processor will have a 4th button called justify. And what justify does, and this is actually a nice little graphic, I'm just going to make it a little bigger so we can see it, is it basically, if you allow the content to sit as it kind of normally does, right? So I'm putting 3 images in an area, and I say, flex start, it'll take all the stuff and move it over to the left side, because left is start in the English speaking world, right? It is. If I say flex end, it basically moves it to the right. Interesting. All right. I can also center it, so they're all together and in the center. I can also issue the command to do space between, so it takes it all the way to the left and the right, and then equally spaces them otherwise. Or I can do space around, which kind of equally balances all the space. And if you were to be able to count the pixels, this space here is half the size of this space here, right? So it, this is, if you call this one portion, this is two portions here, two portions and one portion. This is pretty handy too. Now, the reason this is amazing, right? You guys might not feel that it's amazing, but when we used to try to code this stuff by hand using all the other layout techniques, man, you would be there for hours going, oh my God, I gotta, like, how many pixels is that? And how many pixels in this? Oh my God, I made it a little smaller. Now it doesn't fit. Oh my God, right? That's kind of like the hassle of it, real frankly. The flex techniques have now made it so easy to configure the items in this fashion. It's in many cases silly not to use it, right? So I'm just kind of showing this to you here. Now, there are more flexbox properties, right? And I think W3 gets into all of these too. So, yeah, so these ones are a little bit more, I'm going to say, technical in a sense, right? But if you look at what they do and you figure out that it applies to your situation, you can apply the techniques basically. But if I use the align items property, the browser takes the extra space along the cross axis. So like if you want to, look at what the cross axis is, it's operating in the 90-degree dimension, like 1/4 turn to the right, or, if you're going across, this one's going down. And if you're going across or down, then the cross axis is the other way. But it controls the spacing on the cross axis, basically, is the way to say it, right? There's also a flow. Now, we already played with the wrap, right? So we saw that if we add wrap, the objects move down the line automatically. And if we don't, then they just stay on the same line and just keep getting smaller, right? Then there's also the direction, and the direction is the one that kind of, so for example, like, are you going horizontal or are you going vertical, right? Then there's the order property, which will take the stuff, even though things are coded in a certain order. So we have box 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. The order property can reverse that order or change it. That's pretty weird. And they give warnings about it. And I think it's really kind of a weird one to use. I haven't thought of any practical reason to use this, honestly. Maybe the one exception would be like if I was, for example, I'm just throwing this out there, and we talked about this, the English language is left to right, but there are languages that are right to left, like Arabic, for example, or Hebrew or something like that. And maybe you could, like, if somebody had like a language switcher on a website and you switch to Arabic, maybe you could change the order of your boxes to match the language, right? So that would be the only scenario I could think of where that's useful. And I would bet that's why it was developed. The other kind of interesting thing here is that flex items are basically set up to be generic. So in other words, if I put stuff inside of a container that's being flexed, I don't have to worry so much about exactly how they're sized, because flex will take over and change that sizing. And maybe kind of a good way to demonstrate that, right? Like if I Control Z my way back to the original here and run it, right? And notice it says a width of 100, and I'm not sure if we're ever reaching 100. I guess that's 100, right? When I exceed the bounds and it just sits in that one spot. But you could also, in principle, and I don't know how this will run here, we'll see, All right, so I took away all the width things, and now this isn't really kind of as dramatic because it will never fit because it's adjusting to the size of the content. But the point is that the width is almost separate here, right? Because once I'm running this and I'm declaring a width, that's going to be its maximum width. So you can play with those width settings also. Is kind of the point. Yeah, and we can also use it to do proportional, so we can configure it actually with a number of different tools. Now, here's kind of a weird way to do this, and you'll notice that they have this layout here, and I think this is kind of a nice little example. But if I was to put in some flex stuff on this website, and I decide that I don't like, well, I want to have like 3 columns and I want them to flex, but how big should each column be relative to the other column? This is really kind of a fascinating thought. So what this code would do is I can actually use this sizing. I guess it's a sizing thing, right? So it's like I'm saying that I have basically 10 columns, right? One column here, 7 columns here, and 2 columns here. So when I'm on the screen, the aside will occupy the space of 2 columns, main will occupy the space of 7 columns, and nav will occupy the space of 1 column, respectively, like in a ratio. I don't have to calculate the width or anything like that, but they'll always stay in those relative amounts regardless of the size of the screen. I think W3 has an example of that here, if I'm not mistaken. I guess they don't, right? Yeah, they do not. All right, I don't want to go through the trouble of coding this right now because I want to more get through the material. This is a really fascinating technique. I would say that it's not brand new. I want to make you aware of that. It's been around for, I don't know, like maybe close to 10 years now. But very few people were using it initially, but I'm starting to see more and more people using it. I'm starting to see WordPress themes that have it built in, and it can be highly effective way at making your content very consistent, especially if you plan wisely with it. All right, so that's Flex, folks. All right. The other thing that I want to talk about is what we call the CSS grid. This is a really weird thing that's been around a long time. There was a time, I'm going to say prior to the official release of HTML5, so pre-2014, that there were all these other systems, and I don't even know if they're still out there, but just for example, like the first one I ever encountered was called 960 Grid, right? And there's the website's still there. That's pretty cool. But basically, what the 960 Grid would do is it would help you. Let's just look at one of the examples here. And actually, this is the website's completely different now. But the point is that you would build the website, and somebody figured out, I don't know, 15 plus years ago, that most people, when they're looking at content on the web, are not exceeding certain screen sizes. Now, I'm on a screen that's 1920 pixels across, almost 2000 pixels. If I narrow up my screen here, right, when I get down to about this point, this is probably about 1000 pixels. And right when I hit the edges of their container, that's 960 pixels, which, by the way, fits nicely on tablets and phones horizontally. Not so good on phones vertically, though. But back then, somebody said, okay, 960 pixels is a great amount for most screens to fit. So if you have a setup for your web page where you take 960 pixels, put it in the center of the screen, and then the sidebars, whatever, who cares? But that's where the content should be. And they developed this whole system, and basically it's a template, right, that you can drop your stuff into. and it creates a very orderly looking website. And if you look at their website examples, these are dated, by the way, but still, even though they're examples from 15 years ago, you can tell that they're kind of using the same techniques. There's columns, the columns are nicely organized, everything's lining up perfectly, right? And it's because of that system. Well, W3 Schools basically saw that these grid systems getting really, really popular. And somewhere here, in fact, I should probably just once again search it. So I'm doing Control F, CSS grid. There it is. All right. And so they have a whole section on this. Now, where this is a little bit different is that we're not focusing on one row or one column. We're focusing on really kind of a whole layout, right? And it basically controls both the vertical and the horizontal. This is a system that is unique. The CSS grid system is unique to W3 Schools. They developed it. It hasn't really gained a lot of traction. Okay, so I'm kind of giving you that as a heads up. Not a lot of people are using it professionally. However, it does work. And like the flex technique, you notice how all the containers adjust in size, right? Automatically. And basically what they do is they set up the HTML. Notice once again, we have a container div. We have a bunch of stuff inside of it, not necessarily in any particular order. I guess it's kind of a top to bottom, left to right thing, right? But they're just kind of thrown in there. And then via CSS, we first declare each one of the items that has its own class, an area, and we give it a name. So we call it, okay, so what is this? Is a header, a menu, a main, a right, a footer, kind of the stuff that we've been doing. And so that's the naming convention of the style, kind of following this approach. And then we also put display grid on the container, and then we tell it how to lay it out. And this is really kind of bizarre syntax, right? So the first row is all header. Header, 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 header. 6 columns, I guess, basically. Right. The next row is menu, main, 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 right, right. And kind of like the flex thing where it was like relative amounts, that's what's going on here. But you declare them verbally instead of numerically. The bottom, once again, there's kind of like menu, menu, footer, 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 footer. And you can see the effect, right? You can also declare the gap in between the portions, which is a smart thing to do. And then they're just doing a little bit of CSSing here, nothing too fancy. But you can see here's another technique that you can use to control the layout of your website. And for all I know, maybe this is your design, right? If you don't like this design, for example, and I'm just going to kind of give you some food for thought here. If I didn't want my menu in the sidebar, right? And if I know that there's basically 6 columns, I could just go menu, 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 right? That's 6. And then I would have to expand these other 2 boxes. So I would need another footer here to get it up to 6, and probably another main. I'm just kind of saying. All right. And then let's go ahead and run this. And then you see what it did, right? So change the structure. Now, granted, this isn't the prettiest thing in the world, but this might be a structure that you're using, right? Or, whatever, you're conceiving in your head, then you just throw your content into these areas and all that content will automatically adjust. That's pretty slick. And it's not that hard to do. I mean, the basic structure of this is really, really simplistic, right? So that's the CSS grid. And I don't know how much more the author talks about it, right? So they have lines, rows, columns, tracks, and gaps. I think we kind of looked at most of that stuff. And you determine, you know, how many vertical or horizontal grids you're working with, right? In the example on W3 schools, we used 6 columns, but you can ramp it up. You can make it 7 or 10 or 3 or whatever. It doesn't matter, right? But they will relatively fill the whole screen. And I think that that's really kind of a neat technique too. Once again, this hasn't caught on maybe as much as Flex has caught on, but this one I think is actually more versatile. And you know what? I think very useful. All right, so they give some example here as well, but in their example, I want you to notice the author is actually hard coding sizes, and I think that this is kind of interesting. So you can hard code if you're not happy with like a generic size, you can tell it how wide a column is or how tall a row is, and code that in. And then the grid still operates around it, but that would be the default size. So, like for example, you might want to get an effect like this, and a CSS grid is not a bad way to do it, right? It's actually a pretty logical way to do it. Notice once again that, you know, they're declaring all the columns and their size, and they're declaring all the rows and their size. And then the rest kind of happens automatically once you display the grid. So you could very easily come up with basically a div, right? Or some other container, give it the ID of gallery, tell it to display grid, set up the columns and the rows, and then just insert your content, right? And typically we use divs to do that work. And the beauty of it is it creates a nice, beautiful, clean structure that's, I think, fairly easy to work with, right? You notice I'm not demonstrating this technically. Once again, I didn't want to like alter my website right now because we would be here forever watching me do that. When you are working with these grid systems, they have some values that they kind of throw in here. So there's a standard approach of like using pixels, right, to count things out. You can also go with percentages. So if I wanted to make a column, for example, 50% or 40%, 60%, I can do that. That's a pretty common technique too. There's a numeric FR unit, right, that we call the flex factor, that takes whatever space the browser has available and determines what the remaining space is as a percentage automatically. So if you're not good with your math, this is kind of one of the beautiful things about this too, is it kind of auto adjusts based with that FR thing. All right, so they have these like min max things also. So like if you don't want to let it get too small or too large, you can preset that. I think that's pretty useful too. And then there's also the repetition thing that you can throw in that automatically repeats some of the content. The row and column properties are ones that you often tweak. I don't know how far they go on W3 schools explaining this stuff, but I guess it's worthy of kind of right. They have some pretty nice little simple examples here. You know, so this is another one that you can adjust. And I wish I could adjust it horizontally here easily. I don't know if I can. I guess not. I guess I can adjust the browser window to show you. It adjusts the other way as well, which is kind of neat. They get into the whole containerized setting on this. And here's an example of where they're using auto. Right, the effect, I mean, it's functionally the same, but just so you know that it's out there, you do have references if you want to try to do this. The grid item, this is where you can actually break stuff down. So this is where it gets a little deeper, because I can set up a bigger grid, and then inside the bigger grid, I can create a smaller grid. Also completely adjustable based on the outer grid. All right. So that does go down the rabbit hole a little bit, but folks, that's the CSS grid system, kind of in a nutshell. Um, they have a couple of examples here. So like if you were looking to do a 2-column layout with a CSS grid system, here's an example of a website that's got 3 rows. And I mean, kind of seems like 2 columns, right? But they're adjusting it. So I want to show you some of the cool little tricks they're doing here. The one cool little trick is they're hard coding the width of the navigation to 150 pixels. Right? I'm not a huge fan of the side navigation these days, but there's a place for it. The other side is we have the FR width, which means that it will determine on its own what this size should be without having to do any math or figuring out the size or anything. It'll just automatically adjust. The height is automatic, right? So I think that's kind of interesting. With the header, they declared a height because apparently they must want it to be a certain size, maybe through the logo or the font that they're using or whatever. Where the footer has an auto height, right? So I think these are really pretty slick little techniques. The line numbers for the grid, I just want you to notice, are basically identify the starting and ending line numbers separated by a character. So here's just kind of a quick little example. So the header is in grid row 1, 2, and grid column 1 to 3. So remember what that means is starting and ending line number, right? So if you go back here and take a look, here's the line. So, so aside from thinking like numbering the column, we're numbering the lines on the edges of the column, right? So since we have basically 2 columns, the header column starts with line 1, but goes to line 3. So the header column starts at line 1 and goes to line 3. See that? And then if you do the row for the header starts at line 1 and goes to line 2. So starts at line 1, goes to line 2. So pick some other random element here, like the main. Well, where does the column start? Line 2 goes to line 3. Same with the row. So main is 2 and 3, 2 and 3. So what this allows you to do is if you want to sketch it out, you can sketch it out, make your own grid, determine all the sizes, and then configure based upon the line numbers that you're using where it sits in the grid system. Right. They have a little bit of an example of that layout that they're talking about right here, right? It's a little lighthouse thing with the resulting version. You can also dig into the grid areas. So for example, notice the header, we're calling it a header. This is kind of weird. So the Flex kind of did the same thing. I don't know if you guys picked up on that. And they're using kind of like the standard HTML5 semantic tags to do it. They're saying, well, the header tag is going to be a header in the grid area. Makes sense. The nav is going to be a nav, etc. And then you can configure each one of those areas completely separately, right? And so I can tell the outer container to display the grid. I can set up the columns and the rows. This is based on that lighthouse thing, by the way. And then the template areas, and then do the layout. Remember like how we did this before on the W3 site, kind of the same way. And I'll tell you what, I think that this is probably, if you struggle with this approach is maybe a little bit easier to think through, real frankly, right? Because you think of what goes in the grid as opposed to the edges of the grid, right? They give you all the code for it. So if you wanted to replicate that, here's all the styles for it. All right, here's what we're going to do at this point. We're going to take a 5-minute break because we've been going for a while. So I'm going to pause the video here. All right, so another kind of interesting little technique they're pointing out here, and I probably should have finished these couple next slides before we took break, but hey, this is how it goes sometimes. There's kind of this neat technique, and you see it on a lot of websites these days, and I'm going to show you the output first, where you go to a website and they basically have content like this, right? Like you have this big image, fills the whole screen, and then they have some sort of text in the middle, and it's like perfectly like sitting there, and it looks beautiful. And then you try to create this with regular HTML, and you discover it to be a nightmare, because it can actually be kind of challenging to code. And I'm going to give you like a really silly little example here. But when we put the Prometheus server online, and if you go to the default homepage for Prometheus, which is just the URL, it's kind of what we went for here, but I used a very different technique when I built this page. I am the one who coded this one, because there is text. So this is an actual font, right? And then there's this background image. And if you take a look, and of course it won't let me view source, so I have to inspect instead, right? And you start breaking it down. Well, that's the head. I got all my CSS techniques here, but there's really not much in the body. The whole body is one div with a word in it. That's it. That's all the HTML. All the rest of it really is in the CSS. And if you look at the technique here, I just use the background image, a background color, which you don't normally see unless you zoom way out. And then I said no repeat. And then this other trick called background size cover, which fills the whole window with the background image. And then the rest of it really is just basically doing font work on the name Prometheus. And you can see that I'm using the Google Font API. I will talk about how to do that later, but basically I wanted a certain font and I found it there, and basically I'm linking to it. But the point is, right, to achieve this effect, that's how I achieved it, right? When we look at the technique talked about in the book, now they're doing this using Flex, right? And so basically, how do you do that? You basically, whatever tag you're using, it could be anything really. You tell it to display Flex. You set a minimum view height of 100. You justify the content, align to the center, set up your font, background colors, and whatever. The image you're loading, background size. Now that's the same technique I use, except I use a command called cover. 100%, 100% says 100% width, 100% height, by the way. And then no repeat of the background, which was the same command that I use. So similar and kind of a dramatic effect, kind of pretty cool, right? Depending on what you're trying to accomplish, it might be something you could use. Just throwing it out there. One little catch with some of this stuff. So when HTML5 was brand new, not all the browsers supported the grid system or the flexbox. And real frankly, a lot of the modern CSS features were not supported by all browsers. I can safely say that all the major browsers now do. And by that, I mean Chrome, Firefox, Edge, and Safari. Those are the big four. Maybe throw Opera into the mix, and I think it works there too. But if you're ever playing with CSS features that might or might not work, they have this little thing that you can throw in your CSS code, which basically says, hey, if your browser supports this, please use this instead. And you put all your styles inside there for your grid. Otherwise, you'd have a different system that you're using to do your layout. Not a huge fan of having like alternate versions, real frankly. But if a new technique comes out and you want to try it, that's kind of an approach you can use to do it. The concept is that they want to kind of make all the pages like future compliant, and this is one technique for doing it. Not a super huge fan, right? I'd rather go with something I know is going to work rather than take a chance at it not. Another important tag that we've seen developed over the years, and this came from originally from the Apple world, and here's the why. Because Apple was really the first company that had a smartphone the way that we know it today. So I think it was like 2007, 2008, something like that. They came out with the first iPhone, and they developed this extension basically that is a meta tag that takes our viewport, which is the screen we're looking at basically, and it scales it to 100% based on the width of the device. Now, this is really kind of an interesting thought. So if I'm like looking at my browser, I may or may not be at 100%. Like sometimes, like you zoom in on stuff. And isn't it really interesting with like the CSS I have in here? When I zoom in and out, it's only the font that changes. Right. That's kind of a weird web page. But the point being, you might land on a web page and your zoom might not be at 100% and might not be scaled to your device. And what the viewport meta tag does is it probes your device screen width, whether you're horizontal or vertical, and then sets you to 100%, filling that view width. And so for mobile in particular, this has kind of become almost the standard setting that a lot of people put on their websites, so that if somebody lands on your website with a phone, it automatically scales to their phone. And I'll give you an example. Have you guys ever gone to a website on your phone and it's like, oh my God, that's tiny, right? And you can barely like see the stuff because they did not throw this tag in, or they did not design it to be on a phone. And then you're sitting there trying to, pinch and zoom and try to get in there to the content, and it's just not working. Right. So this is a tag that you can add. They give an example here. So if you take a regular desktop page and load it on your phone, it may look like this. Whereas if I use the viewport meta tag, it might load up and do this. Now, it's still not perfect, but this is a lot more readable on a phone than this would be. That's kind of the point. All right. So how then does a designer write code that then can adjust dynamically to the size of a device? And there's two techniques that we can use to do what we call a media query. What a media query is the basically what's going to go on is the device, when it hits the web page server will reach out, probe your device, and let it know my screen is so many pixels wide. So this is kind of weird. So when you hit a website, the website knows how wide your screen is. It also knows your IP address, etc. It's a lot of weird stuff like that. But what media queries basically bring to the table is the ability to write separate CSS depending on the width of your screen. So I can do that by either applying the media query inside the link tag, so I can have two separate style sheets. So if I have a wide screen, I can have a separate style sheet, or if I have a narrow screen, I can have a separate style sheet for that, right? Some designers like that approach. I don't see a lot of people doing it exactly this way. More often, I see people using this technique, which is they add the media query inside their CSS file, and it just basically says at the max width of whatever pixel amount you choose, apply these styles to these tags, overriding the default. So in other words, if I'm making my screen narrower, right, and I'll play with this on my site when we get there. Let's see if I can find my site, right? So I'm playing with my site. I'll go to the home page because this page is horrible, right? And I'm decreasing the size of the screen. And for the most part, it doesn't look that bad, getting smaller until, the images start breaking out of the box. See that? That's a problem. And then when I get really narrow, like a phone, I think the fonts are too big, maybe. The image is certainly too big. Do I really need the space on the sides? Probably not. I could get rid of that, right? And what the media query does is it says at certain pixel widths, we're loading different CSS, right? And that's a technique we are going to play with here tonight. I'm going to finish the lecture part first, though, and then we'll do the demo on it in just a little bit. So, for example, if I loaded up a media query on the Lighthouse Bistro, I might set it up to look more like this, right? And then if you can imagine taking your big fat finger and trying to touch that on a screen, this you could probably work with, where something like this, like how would you even click the navigation? I can barely even see it, right? So that's kind of the grand point, is you write different CSS in a media query. The other thing to keep in mind here is that it's been a while now, but yeah, there's this guy, and they actually have his name here. This guy named Luke, I guess, came up with this thought that as the web got more popular on a phone, and now it's like completely taken over, we need to design first for mobile phones before we design for the desktop, right? Because why? Most people surf on their phones. And on top of it, they're not surfing horizontally, they're surfing vertically. Weird, right? So it takes different kind of layout techniques to kind of do that. So what you end up doing is sometimes you write media queries to kind of adjust for typically 3 different display sizes. Basically, a large display, which would be a desktop or a laptop, wider than tall, right? A medium display, which we think about as like a tablet view, like an iPad or something like that. And then we have the small display, which is designed for the phone. And notice by the time you get to the small display, they kind of cast away this thought of multiple columns, right? Where on a large display, we might do 3 columns, a medium display, we do 2, and a small display, we do 1. The one side I always like to show for this, right? And I think I've done this before with you guys, is I go to the Boston Globe, which is like the primary newspaper of the city of Boston. And this was the very first website that ever used media queries. The advantage of a media query is this: the dynamic change of your screen size. And I'll just kind of like incrementally reduce the size. For a while, the content is flexing, if you will. And then when we get to a certain point, like here, now we went from a 3-column layout to a 2-column layout. And then when I drop all the way down to a mobile view, it's 1 column. The menu disappears. We get the little hamburger menu up top here. But that looks pretty darn good. And if this is what it looked like on my phone, that would work. But notice I did not reload the page. I didn't reload the CSS. I didn't get a different style sheet based on the width of my screen. The CSS that I have via media queries automatically adjusted. This is a really important technique. I think, take it for whatever it's worth. And when we start to like build websites that are designed for mobile, and you build your site wisely, and I think that this is really kind of a nice image she has here, where she has a desktop view, then a tablet view, and then a smartphone view, and all of them look good, right? They're all readable. I think it's kind of an interesting approach, and we can't predict, honestly, how people will look at the page. So having a page that dynamically adjusts makes a heck of a lot of sense. It really does. All right. If you want to work with images, also, and this is a layout problem for a lot of designers, right? So I put this image on the thing and I want it to fill the whole screen, but then when I make it bigger or smaller, it doesn't work anymore. I kind of demonstrated that with the Prometheus page a little bit, but here's a kind of a simpler technique. You can actually set an image to be a max width of 100%. 100% of what? Whatever thing it's sitting inside of, basically. And then you set the height to auto, and it will automatically scale. So, point is, if I bring it up in my desktop and I have a big image, it fits. If I move it down to a tablet size, it fits. And then if I'm on the small, it also fits, right? And maybe not in the way you want, but there's other techniques for this as well. Okay, so here's one of what we call the new tags of HTML. And normally when we put an image on a page, we use the image tag. Guess what, folks? There's a picture tag too. And this one is designed to automatically adjust which image you're serving based upon the size of your screen, right? And it's built into the tag. I have started to see some people use this. I don't know how in depth people are using it. But here's a technique that you could employ, right? And it's basically the same result, right? So you get kind of the same output as the flex technique, but they are literally loading different images at different screen widths, right? And then they have a fallback image, which is probably the original image to begin with. So the challenge with this one is now I'm creating 4 images for every image. Right. So whatever image I'm putting on my website, I got to create a small, medium, and large, and a fallback, which is usually the original. Very interestingly, when you work with content management systems like WordPress, WordPress automatically does this. It will, like, you upload an image into WordPress, it keeps the original, and then creates various sizes depending on what theme you're using, usually at least 3 different sizes. And then when you need to pull that image in at various sizes, it dynamically adjusts to the right size. I don't think it's using the picture tag, but the picture tag is one of the newest HTML5 tags. It's been around for a few years now, and we were saying for a while that it was going to be part of HTML6, but I don't see 6 coming anytime soon. So they just brought it into HTML5. It works. Most of the browsers support it. I can't say with any certainty that all of them do, but any browser I've tried it in does work, by the way. All right. Here's another technique that's new to HTML5. And this is where we basically do the same thing. We provide different images, but we use the original image tag. And instead of using just a singular source, we have a source set, which just lists the large image, the width it applies at, medium, the width, small, the width, right? So that's another technique. So these two are 2 pretty new techniques. Feel free to experiment with them if you want. I would say they're more on the advanced side, but no harm done in trying them. All right. Now, if you are building for mobile, okay, and this is, and really whatever platform you're building for, whether it's a desktop, tablet, mobile, gaming system, television set, I don't care, wherever it's going to output to. It's best to test with the actual device. So for example, if I'm building something for mobile phones, it's best to test it with a phone, horizontal and vertical. If I'm building it for the desktop, test with a PC, test with a Mac, right? Test with a small screen, test with a laptop, test with a desktop, test with a like humongous screen. What does it look like? Does it work, right? However, there are these other really kind of simple little tools. Some of them are already built into our browser, by the way, where they actually have emulators for devices that basically allow you to view your web page in a simulated phone, right? I'm going to say that functionally, I don't think that's really necessary because, real frankly, when I'm doing something like this and I can just narrow up my browser to look like a phone, it's what it's going to look like on a phone. However, okay, and here's the however, built into the inspect tool of Chrome and Firefox and Edge and Safari, all of those, they have this little menu here, right? And it says toggle device toolbar. So I'm just going to click it. And then you can either declare the dimensions or you can actually pick a device. So, for example, this is what it would look like on an iPhone. And this is built right into Google Chrome. This is what it would look like on a Galaxy Z Fold 5. Doesn't look too great. Another Galaxy. How about an iPad Pro? Right. It's also like, what zoom level are you at? You can control that. And what happens if you rotate the device? And it simulates it. And this is all inside your browser already. So this is one way you can also test. And then you can also like simulate like the actions of clicking, for example, as well. So that's right here in the inspect panel. Just look for the device toggle, and then you can choose your device. Kind of handy. Right. They do show a little screenshot here of testing with the mobile emulator from Opera. Feel free to try out those websites, right? The ones that they had listed here. But the device mode in Google Chrome is just built into the browser. Firefox has a pretty nice one too. And if I'm not mistaken, you can also add additional templates. But long story short, nothing simulates the actual device, right? And the quirks of an actual device. Don't forget to validate your code and check your code and use the validator. But this will end basically the chapter 7 lecture, folks. And then what I'm going to do now is I'm going to do a little bit of demonstration on how to add some media queries to the tail end of this recording. All right, so I'm here now on the W3 School site, and I'm about to do a little bit of a demo on media queries. And media queries, as I said, basically are a way for your page to dynamically adjust to the screen width of whatever type of device is viewing your website. There are certain techniques that we use here, and I should probably zoom in so you can read stuff on the page here. Some of the media types that we can design for. So this is kind of interesting thought too. Typically when we put in a media query, we're designing it for any device, right? And that's what I would recommend, is that you always do all. We can also do a media query for print, which is usually for the print preview mode. That's kind of interesting. I don't know why I'd go to the trouble of that. Or the screen, which is mostly for computers, tablets, smartphones, etc. Right? If you don't declare it, the default, I think, is all. Right? Common things that we can attach to. Normally, we're doing most of the media queries based on the width of the screen, right? But we can declare the max width, the min width, or a range of width. So I can kind of do like max of 1,000 and min of 500, for example, right? And anything in between those will get these particular styles. We can also declare for the orientation. So if you want to go to this kind of trouble, it's like, okay, well, here's a media query if the phone's this way, and here's a media query if the phone's that way. And you can do that, right, with media queries. I would caution you on that. But, you know, the standard syntax for this, and I want you to notice that it'll always begin with @media in your CSS code. And then we'll say sometimes what kind of media it is: screen, print, all. I usually leave that off, frankly, or if I say anything, I might say screen. And then the range or minimum value for when it kicks in, right? Okay, so I know that they're going to have a couple of examples here. They do have the example of putting it in the link. Not a fan of that approach, by the way, right? Or having separate files. I much more like this approach. And so this is a really goofy one to try. So let's just go into the editor here. And I want you to notice that basically what they're saying here is we're doing this for the screen, and at the minimum width of 480 pixels, then we just redeclare our styles. Notice there's an opening and closing curly bracket here, and all your styles inside there still have to follow the regular format. But what it's saying is when it's at least 480 pixels, the background color will be light green. Now, if I resize this, okay, well, I guess I'm at least 480 pixels, but at some point, you notice what happened to the background? So this must be, and I want you to notice at 480 pixels minimum, it's light green. I change that to like 479, if I can put it there, and then it goes to pink, which is the default. All right, so helpful for sure, right? Now that's at the minimum width of 480 pixels. The other thing you can do is you can change that and you can say max width, right? So I'll run this. And then once I cross that threshold, it's the pink that's normal for wide. And I prefer to use this approach, right? I think of like the wide screen as the default. And then when I get to the smaller ones where it changes. And that's just one CSS style. This is really kind of a fascinating technique, actually, because once I hit that threshold, I can do all sorts of crazy stuff. For example, did you notice on the Boston Globe site, if I can even find where it is in my browser, right? Go to the Boston Globe. Oh, here's the Boston Globe. Here, let's just refresh this. Go back to their homepage. But did you notice here on this site, you know, that when I adjusted, there were points, right, where, and I'm not seeing, I don't see any ads on their website. Isn't that weird? Who'd have thunk it? A website without ads on the homepage. But what they do is when you drop down here, you notice how like here we have a navigation menu and a search and a sign in and all that stuff. And then we have this like bar that goes across here. And then when we get to the mobile view, well, the logo collapsed down here, the menu changed. So we hid the regular nav and then showed a different nav. Pretty clever, I think, right? The clever techniques. So you can also show and hide stuff when you're doing these views. Now, what I'm going to do here is just for efficiency, I'm going to start closing a few tabs and my view sources and stuff like that. But I'm going to tweak this page a little bit with media queries so you can see how they work. I'm going to focus on the home page for this demo. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to go to my editor. I'm going to close my previously open work, but I am going to open up. Well, okay, so I got to do a couple things here because now I'm in unit 6, right? So on a folder level here, I'm going to make a copy of unit 5. I'm going to paste it back in and call it unit 6. Right. And now I'm going to do all my sample coding in there. I'm going to do a refresh in my file window here. No, we're not going to synchronize. We just want to refresh. All right, so I can see my unit 6, my project, and I'm going to work on my index page. I'm also, here and there, take a look at this, right? The live view, but we're going to stay mostly in code view. So I'm going to put my media queries all the way down here at the bottom. And I'm going to use the W3, and I shouldn't have closed that tab. Let's see if I can pull it back from my history here. There we go. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to borrow their syntax from here. Exactly. I'm going to add that to mine. So now I have this media query and it is set to min width. And I already told you guys, I prefer to do max width, right? Do it the other way. And let's take a look at a couple different things here. I don't want to change my body necessarily, but when I'm working on my page, I do have, and I want to go look now, right? I have a body, right? And then I have my container, right? And the container, I think, is too narrow when I'm on a phone. So that's where I'm focusing my attention. So I'm going to find the container. There it is. And normally the container is set to a width of 73%, right? Right. Here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to take all of that container code. I'm going to copy it and then bring it down to the bottom where the media query is. I'm going to get rid of the body thing. I'll paste in the container style, right? And I'm going to indent this stuff here a little bit. Something like that. All right. And then I've already decided I don't want to make it 73% anymore. I want to make it 100%. And here's the thing. I don't want to change it being centered. So I'm just going to remove that. It's already centered. I don't want to change well, maybe I want to keep these in place. Let's try it. So what I'm going to do right now is I'm going to save this. I'm going to go back to the live view of my page, right? And this is on Prometheus. It's not the actual view from my own computer. So this is where you have to be careful too. So I'm going to look at my local version first. And here it is, right? So it looks normal, right? Now, watch what happens. And I'm not sure if this is kicking in yet here or not. Did I save my CSS file? I'm going to do a little view source here, look at my style sheet, and I'm looking for my, okay, there it is, max width of 480. And so what I want to do here is I want to get that page, and this is where your inspect tool comes in handy also, you guys, because as I narrow up my content here, right, it shows me how wide my view is. If you look right up in this corner here, right? And so what I'm looking for is when I get to 480, and you notice I'm not even there yet, right? No wonder. Will I ever reach it? There we go. And so this is really kind of a weird example, but notice what happened is at 480 pixels, okay, this is what was that, 488? I still have a sidebar. The width is 73%. When I drop down under 480, it's at 100%. It goes all the way to the edges. Now, I have other issues here too, right? For example, we looked at like resizing this image, right? Because this image is not fitting. You guys remember the technique from the PowerPoint that they had on adjusting the image size, right? You notice these settings here. And so what I'm going to do is figure out at what point my image breaks when narrowing up. So I'm going to come out of inspect mode here. And actually, I should stay in inspect mode. And here's the why. Because the inspect mode tells me the pixel amount, right? And so at what point does this image here break out of the container, and it seems like right around 1200 pixels is about like where it starts to change, right? So now I'm going to write another media query. So this will be for a different amount. So I'm just going to copy this syntax, put in my curly brackets, and then I need to find the code for that image. So I'm going to go find that image here, and it's the first image. I don't have like a class or anything like that on it. And you know what? I might not actually need it now that I'm thinking about it. Maybe I can just apply it to the image tag in general. I'm just afraid it might break some other stuff. So let's go back to full screen here. And I'm just going to use that tag right from the PowerPoint exactly. We'll see what happens, right? Worst thing that'll happen is it'll look terrible. Best thing that might happen is it might be perfect. Who knows? So there's that additional media query thrown in there. And I'm going to kind of indent my stuff. I just want it to be easier to look at, you know, kind of more like in the standard kind of format. Sort of like that. And I have already determined that that problem starts to happen at about 1200 pixels, right? That's where it kind of kicks in. Saving the CSS. Now I'm going to go back to the browser here. We're going to refresh. And then I'm going to start resizing. And you notice I'm really close to 1200 already. But now notice the image now that I'm under 1200. You guys notice how the image is automatically scaling. Now, more interestingly, when I get even smaller, all of the images are scaling. Isn't that cool? Even when I hit the other media query, they kind of jump in size and it keeps scaling. Great technique, right? Very simple. And I know, like, if you guys are watching this on the Zoom stream, you might not see the smooth flow of the sizes, right? So I will kind of just incrementally enlarge, and that'll look a little bit better, at least on the stream. Right. Cool technique. Now, the one thing I didn't check, right, and I kind of did this on purpose, is I wasn't watching my header, but even the header's kind of sort of adjusting. I don't like that. You can see what's happening to that image, right? That one's getting squished. And so maybe the auto height thing isn't good. So I might do a different media query for the top, right? So this is really helpful little techniques for doing media queries. These are very simplistic examples, but it is very, very useful. One other technique I will show you, and I don't want to be mean to Homer here, but maybe once we get down to like 480 pixels, I can find that Homer image and make him disappear, right? And so here's the image of Homer. In order for that to happen, I probably want to give it an ID, and I'm just going to call it Homer, right? Homer, right? I'm going to save that. And then here in the style sheet, and I'm going to do it on this media query, I'm just going to say # Homer. When we get down to the small screen, I'm just going to say display none. I'm going to make Homer disappear. Right now, I'm using Homer because I find the animated GIF a little annoying. It's humorous but annoying. But imagine that Homer was like a ad, maybe, right? So if I go back to the browser now and refresh, and then I start once again making this smaller, and we got some other layout problems here. I'm not sure how that one happened. All right, and then you see Homer just plain old disappear. Now there is a little bit of a layout issue there. I'm not sure why Homer is floating like that. Are we on the about page or something? No, whatever. Oh, I think I know why, right? Why is Homer sitting on top of that other thing? Because if you recall, we had told Homer to float right. So I already had a float right on Homer. So I should probably also, and maybe here, all right, we got it. I think we have to investigate first. So I'm looking at like, where does Homer start to sit in the wrong spot on the screen? Pretty much the whole time, it seems. Right. So apparently I shouldn't use Homer as my ID. So let's call it Homer pick, saving it. Now I'm going back to my CSS and I'm going to change this to Homer pick. Right, saving, back to the browser, refreshing. Okay, now Homer's in the right spot again. And now let's make them smaller, smaller. We're still at 600 pixels, 500. Here's 489. And here we cross the threshold and Homer is gone. This is kind of an interesting thought though. So when I'm switching screen sizes, I can make some stuff disappear or other stuff up here, make stuff change size automatically, or widths or fonts or whatever you want to change, you can change with the media query, all based on the screen width. You can also do it with height, but height is a lot more touchy. And generally speaking, the problem is with the width, not with anything else. All right, folks, I'm going to end this recording here. That's a demonstration of media queries, and this video ends